There we are. Okay, so welcome everyone, all of you in person and those of you online, to How Pornographers Conspired to Kill Romance with Dr. Sabrina Strings and Dr. Serene Cotter. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, along with my beloved partner, Donnie Jokum. And the Bureau is an independent, all volunteer, yes, all queer, all the time, bookstore that we founded back in 2012 and that has been here at the LGBT Community Center since 2014. We have regular bookstore hours, Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we often stay open later when we have events such as this. So as an all-volunteer queer bookstore, we are dependent on sales and donations to keep this project afloat. So I'm gonna pass a bag for donations. We generally encourage you to make a donation if you know you won't be buying a book, but you're certainly welcome to buy books and make a donation. And if you can't do either, that's fine. So there's some cash change in the bag. There's also a QR code for Venmo if you'd like to give that way. So I'll pass that around. And those of you watching online, if you'd like to make a donation, you can go to Venmo and find us at BGSQD. And if you're not already on our email list and you would like to be, you can sign up for that back at the register, or you can go to our website, egsqd.com, and sign up for a newsletter, and you'll get that every other Monday. And that just covers our upcoming events, of which we have many. We keep a very busy calendar here at the Bureau, so please check out those events. And before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community House's Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. So, Dr. Sabrina Strings is professor and North Hall Chair of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research examines race, gender, and embodiment in science, media, and medicine. She has been featured in dozens of venues, including BBC News, NPR, Huffington Post, Now This, Essence, Vogue, The Washington Post, Time, and the New York Times. She is the author of the award-winning book, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia. Her second book, The End of Love, Racism, Sexism, and the Death of Romance, was released with Beacon Press. Find her on the Netflix docuseries, The Black Beauty Effect, and the CNN original series, TV on the Edge, Moments That Shaped Our Culture, now streaming on HBO Max. You can follow her latest moves on Twitter at @SAStrings and on Instagram at Yogini Black, Yogi N-I Black. Dr. Serena Cotter holds the J. Newman Chair in Philosophy of Culture at Brooklyn College and is Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her new book, Faux Feminism, Why We Fall for White Feminism and How We Can Stop, sets out to explain what makes white feminism wrong, why it's so easy to end up supporting it, and what feminists might believe in instead. She argues that faux feminisms are rooted in the misunderstanding that feminism is about individual freedom rather than opposition to group-based hierarchy. It has been called a page-turner by Chandra Talpad Mahanti, I hope I pronounced that right. Well-researched, compellingly written, and passionately argued by Kirkus Reviews, and a marvelous and essential read by Rafia Zakaria. And I should mention that we have both books here for sale. We are a functioning bookstore, so please buy some books afterwards, and I'm sure they'd be happy to sign them for you. So please give them both a very warm welcome, and let's get started.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Greg. And it's great to be here with all of you. So, I'm a teacher, and sometimes it's hard to let go of the PowerPoint, but I figured that it would be interesting for people to at least see some of the material that I was using to come up with my analysis, right? Because most people think that it may be relatively easy to enjoy pornography and to have a romance. But part of what I'm showing in my book, it's actually not as simple as it seems, right? So, how pornographers work to kill romance, Playboy, Esquire, and the backlash to feminism. And actually, Greg, perhaps I could ask you to help me advance the slides? Either that or maybe we can move that a little bit closer. I don't know if we can move it.
Yeah.
Maybe about right here. Okay. Yeah, great. So as long as I can still reach it, that would be.
How's that?
Yeah, because I probably won't need to stand. I think I can reach it now.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
And you're in frame.
Okay. Okay. If you were to Google this, you would find that there are so many think pieces that have been written in the past, I want to say 10 years, asking, wait, we were all so enthusiastic about feminism and equal rights, but isn't feminism like killing romance? This is from The Conversation, this is from Medium. In other words, this is not Fox News. This is not Sean Hannity. These are various publications that many of us who consider ourselves to be liberals or progressive might read regularly. And yet there's this sense that somehow feminism is a problem, if you want to have a romantic partnership. And I just decided to give you a screenshot of the number of different think pieces that will come up from a variety of different news sources if you Google feminism and romance. Right? So it's not going to be a full-on presentation, but part of what I'm going to try to show is that contrary to this being something that's new, that's developed in recent years, in reality, this kind of argumentation has been going on since the 1950s. So in the early 1950s, with the rise of publications like Esquire and Playboy, there was the sense, as it was being portrayed in these magazines, that, men need to start pulling back from romance because feminists are actually a tremendous problem. And it was indeed wealthy white male media moguls, straight men, who were advancing these ideas. So now, obviously, when we're talking about pornography, how else do you begin? You always begin with Hugh Hefner, right? Sitting in his throne. And I refer to him as a man, a myth, and a legend because if you were to investigate Hugh Hefner, like I unfortunately had to do for this book, you will realize that there are very few celebrities who did not love this man, right? This is like a compilation of some of the most famous people from when I was growing up, at the very least. Right, so we've got the cast, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and I'm also amazed by the number of women who were just thrilled to be there, right? Snoop Dogg. Where is Snoop Dogg not, right? He's literally everywhere. Not to mention the fact that he was himself a pornographer, another one with Paris Hilton, right? And the other thing to keep in mind is that part of his image is that he was a family man. So he wasn't just a pornographer, he himself also was the kind of person who would frequently get married and have children, right? He had multiple marriages, I'm not sure how many. He had 3, I think, I'm not sure. But this was his most recent wife, Crystal Hefner. And part of what made him, I think, a phenomenon was the fact that he appeared to be balancing these two worlds, like the world of smut and then the world of family life. And it was only after his death that more people started to come out and say, actually, there were some really horrifying things going on there. Yeah. This book is very sad and terrifying, but part of what Crystal Hefner says is, like, for years, I was told by everyone, only say good things, including his other ex-wives, because of course, they're still profiting from his image. Now, I just want to take you through a few paces in his life, because Hugh Hefner enlisted in the Army at the age of 18, and it was in the Army that he was surrounded by pornography. Now, we don't think of the US government as being a pornographer, but it turns out that the US government was a pornographer. I mean, you can see right here, right, Yank, the Army Weekly. Because, of course, for the United States government, because many of us will remember Don't Ask, Don't Tell, they were far more interested in making sure that the recruits were straight than in making sure that they were moral, according to their own standards of morality in the 1940s, right? So they were like, well, we'll just give them the pornography, because at least then they'll be looking at women and they won't be turning gay. Yeah. So he marries his high school sweetheart, she cheats on him, and this immediately disillusions him with the traditional romantic pathway. They stayed married for 10 years, but he said it felt like he was dying inside. So after the divorce, he turned his attention to things he loved, writing and staring at images of naked women. Right? So he is, in fact, a good publisher. I don't think that many of us have any question about that, but many people don't realize that Playboy was not just images of naked women, bending over for the camera. There was so much more to what they were doing. In fact, they were actually trying to reinvent the modern man. And so the magazine launches in 1953 and uses Marilyn Monroe on the cover, of course, without her consent. And it's an instant smash, right? It quickly replaced Esquire as the top men's magazine. And it's important for us to keep in mind that what he set out to do, he largely achieved. He wanted to tell men they no longer had to be the breadwinners, devoted to one woman, going home and worrying about raising the children. He's like, no, you can be an entirely different kind of man. And I just wanted to highlight one point that was in the New York Times article, which is that the magazine intended for men quickly transcended Mr. Hefner's target audience with a subscriber base that cut across gender, race, class, and ideology. It was the world's best-selling men's magazine at its peak, right? In the 1970s, it was selling 7 million copies a month. 84 million copies a year. It seems impossible, right? But this is the magnitude of influence that Playboy had, and Hugh Hefner himself, of course, right? And as you can see here, because Google AI is a great tool, my students can use it so I can use it too. Playboy helped make nudity more acceptable in mainstream publications. It offered men alternative definitions of what it meant to be a man. So what were those alternative definitions? They instructed men largely on how to avoid romance and live life as Hugh did, that is, as a Playboy. So now, the Playboy's a gentleman in his manners and in his dress, but he has to be tough, uncompromising, and God help him rich. Should have charisma and money and power, and he should be luring a revolving door of young women. So if we think about the type of sentimentality that is expected of romantic partnerships, you expect for people to have a deep connection, looking into one another's eyes, feeling as if this person is your person. But notice the model of a Playboy as depicted in Ian Fleming's James Bond, right, 007. Ian Fleming did in fact go to the Playboy mansion, and Hugh Hefner was like, you stole this character from me. And Ian Fleming was like, no, I didn't. But largely he did. So this is an iconic representation of a Playboy, right? Someone who's rich, someone who's tough, and someone who has plenty of young women who he's not interested in. And for those of you who are, let's say at least Zennials and younger, you might recognize this as a common way in which a fuckboy situationship might play out as well. I see, you all can't see them, but there's a number of young people in the audience like, yeah, it's like that. So, in effect, being a playboy is just being a player, right? You're not supposed to have long-term romantic partnerships. So I'm just gonna go quickly through two of the threads. There are multiple threads in the book, but here are two of them that are important for our conversation today. In Playboy, they argued that feminism was a ploy because modern women actually just want money. So Playboy wasn't just about naked women, or it wasn't just about sex. It was also a number of high-powered men who were prominent in the media writing about the problem of relationships, of romance, and of feminism. So William Iverson was a popular author. He wrote several books, including a book called The Pious Pornographers. And he was a contributor to Playboy in 1963 for an article titled Love, Death, and the Hubby Image. And this is a representation of this particular article. The cloying quicksand of calculated exploitation make a mordant travesty of the marrying male's romantic dreams. And the article begins this way. Tired of the rat race? Fed up with job routine? Well then, how would you like the chance to make $8,000 to $20,000, as much as $50,000 and more each year, working at home in your spare time? Yes, an assured lifetime income can be yours in an easy, low-pressure part-time job that will permit you to spend much of each and every day as you please, relaxing, reading, watching TV, playing cards, socializing with friends. Now, evidently, this ad was not real. It was a phony ad that was a representation by Iverson of what women are actually seeking in a relationship. Not love, just the support of a man who has money. And he says the very concepts of romantic love and devotion were masculine creations which have been sung and celebrated by male poets, novelists, composers, and playwrights for at least 600 years, right? So that was the other thing that was amazing. These men writing for Playboy knew so much about the history of romance, which is in fact an idea that was created by Western Europeans during the 12th century. So the fact that they would have all of this information was sort of mind-blowing, because I think many of us think that romantic love and having a sexual love are the same, but they're not, right? Romantic love is a script that was created by Western Christian Europeans. And then he's like, ultimately, marriage is a bum deal for men because it is an institution that has been brought into question by the ill-natured and excessive demands placed on it by American women. True romantics, according to Iverson, should remain bachelors and seek sex without legal attachment. Now, how that makes you a true romantic is not clear, but the point is, like, these horrible, like, feminists are, like, ruining romance, so don't get into romance anymore. Now, in addition to that, there was another prominent thread in which they were like, don't commit to feminists. Ugh. They are ruining marriage and America. This was actually the most common type of article I found referencing marriage. Right. So Philip Wiley was a well-known writer. His works were routinely mentioned in the New York Times and the Washington Post. He wrote a comic called The Gladiator that is believed to have inspired Superman. How incredible is that? You know, America's favorite emotionally unavailable superhero. He's always gonna go, he can't be there with his lady. Right? And part of what they would do with Philip Wiley was talk about the fact that America is being womanized by feminism. This is supposed to be a great travesty. So Philip Wiley says, what I'm about to describe here is an historical process that has led to the current sad condition. It is a condition in which a deadly distaff encroachment, so distaff is an historical slur against women, especially women who might be feminists, a deadly distaff encroachment of what started as feminism and has matured into wanton womanization. So they were ginning up a lot of fear that women who are invested in equal rights, which is what feminism is largely about, were actually trying to take over America. One of the people who was featured in the womanization series was Norman Mailer. And I bring that up partially because people have sometimes questioned whether or not Norman Mailer was a feminist. And I'm like, well, did you look at his writing? Because actually, Norman Mailer was one of these people who was like, oh my gosh, this feminism, it's destroying the virility of America slowly and steadily, right? And so I want to show you these individuals because, again, these were powerful, prominent men, right? That he was adding to the roster of writers for Playboy in order to make a stronger case against romance and in favor of playerism and pornography. Now, it's not as if they didn't think anyone should get married. I mean, obviously, again, Hugh Hefner was married many times. So there had to be a certain type of woman that they would accept. It was the good girls. Right? So they were like, you can get married, but only commit to women who are hot, sweet, thin, and pliant. These are women they called lavishers. In my book, I call them sufficiently white. They rarely made mention of Black women at all, right? And when they did, these were usually thin and light-skinned women, right? In fact, there was even an article that I'll just show you briefly in which they were so concerned that America had been womanized that they were like, you can't even find a good girl in America anymore. You have to go to Asia. So, so in 1968, an anonymous author wrote of the girls of the Orient, where in Korea and Japan and Vietnam, the Asian girl still devotes herself single-mindedly to pleasing her man, right? Because Asia is a feminist caesura. So you just go there and you just hook up with the forest maidens, you know, in their trim, half-clothed bodies. I mean, like, just the depth of Orientalism in this, right? But it's like the very idea, America is lost, but you can still get a good girl, just probably not here. So what is the result? So already by 1954, they were like, what have we been up to with this pornography stuff? Because I showed you that some of this pornography, especially that which was produced by the government, goes back to the 40s. And so in a conversation with one of their favorite authors, Philip Wiley, he's like, we decided that we wanted an American ideal woman, the dream girl of national adolescence, right? The pin-up, the glamour puss. We insulted women and disenfranchised millions from love. Imagine them having the self-reflection to know what they were doing, but still think it was important to continue doing it. They did not care that they were disenfranchising women from love, but they knew that that was the end result. And for us, we can understand how this has contributed to fuckboyism. Because as we saw earlier, the relationship between the fuckboy and the player is quite close. And the major difference is that players are expected to be like gentlemen and wealthy, but fuckboys can be from any background, right? Any amount of money. The key difference is that the currency for the player is sex, but the currency for the fuckboy is emotions, right? It's the withholding of love. That was also, of course, part of the plan, even of the Playboy. But I'll end on a hopeful note, because in the book, I argue that we don't need romance. If you look into the definition of romance, and these are from the Oxford English Dictionary and the Collins Dictionary, it describes romance, sorry, this is quite small, you can't really see it here, but a romance between two people who are in love with each other, but are not married to each other. That's the first definition of Collins in the Oxford English Dictionary. An exciting, usually short relationship between two people who are in love with each other. So you may be saying, wait, why do they think this? And why do we think that romance leads to marriage? Romance, as I mentioned, began in the 12th century. For hundreds of years, it was about infidelity. It was an escape from marriage because marriage used to be arranged. In the 18th century, marriage was attached to romance in the Western world, right at the time in which, like, all of the institutions, the traditional institutions in the Western world were crumbling, right? We're talking about the French Revolution and the US Revolution. They did this, the people who were agitating for this did it as a substitute for what women were demanding in the middle of these institutions falling, which was equality. Like, you think about someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, right? Like, you can remember some of these old feminists from that era. So that even in the 18th century, they were like, well, now it's actually a way of declaring war against a woman's virtue. So we don't need to have that last one. The main thing I just want us to think about is love stories can be beautiful, but love stories don't necessarily follow a path in which there's very clear gender roles of tough guys and good girls that lead to marriage and you're together forever. No, a love story is a relationship that you have with someone that can grow and flourish, or sometimes it will dissolve, but it doesn't have a time limit and it doesn't have rules. We can love more inclusively and expansively if we let go of the romantic ideal that is built on the gender binary, not to mention heterosexism. So thank you for listening. And now I'd like to invite Serene to come up so we can discuss.
First, I wanted to tell you in the audience, I was going to make a joke about how when I got asked to be in conversation with Sabrina Strings tonight, on Valentine's Day, I said to my husband, like, okay, bye. But now I know it's because we have no romance, actually, because when we got married to each other, apparently, that means there's no romance there. But yeah, let's talk about your wonderful book. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was, you coin all of these like wonderful terms in there. Tonight you guys heard about fuckboyism already. Can we talk about also cis-handed men and the masculine sex cult?
Yes.
Or the masturbatory sex cult, it's worse than MSC. Yeah.
Yeah, let's get right into it. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I definitely have taken inspiration from so many different people as I was describing fuckboyism, because it's one of those words that we all sort of know about in the ether, but it was hard to pin down a specific definition. So I was like, okay, let me go through all the blogs and see what I can find. And that's how I arrived at the definition of fuckboyism. And so I wanted to talk about the ways in which these kinds of men, these fuckboys, are operating in relationships with women. And I described some of them as being cis-handed, which is like, instead of being cis-het, which is like cisgender heterosexual, they are cisgender pansexuals. And their sexuality is built off of watching the kind of pornography that dehumanizes women and getting off to that, right? I'm not trying to suggest that people cannot enjoy pornography that shows two people in a respectful interaction. What I'm suggesting is that that's not mostly what these men are watching. And so in the book, I detail that the top kinds of pornography are pornography involving mom, right? We've heard the term MILF. You've heard it. Yeah. But did you know that men were just searching for the word mom? That was one of the top searches on Pornhub. And then the other top searches, stepsister. Yeah. right? There's a lot of troubling incest porn. And so,
And can I add that
please, yeah.
the number one trending Pornhub search last year was trad wife, which
Oh, yeah.
also fits into a lot of what you just talked about.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Because, so I mean, thank you for mentioning that. Because it's like, even in Pew Research studies, there are so many young men, really men of all ages, who are straight, who are like, well, I want to be married and I want to have kids. But they also want to be assured that those women are trad wife-like. So what we're experiencing now is this tremendous backlash to feminism that, rather than being in our faces, is happening behind the scenes in these publications that most women will not read. So that's how I came up to cishanded. And it's also related to the masturbatory sex cult. Like, we think of a cult as being like cloistered away in a handful of people, but what if there's a godhead, Hugh Hefner, telling people what's attractive and what they should want and how they should behave, and having ritual masturbation to that, right? So that's the reason why I've described these cishanded men as being in a masturbatory sex cult.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just got the explanation of cishanded, so now I'm extra excited. But one of the things, you did such a good job in this presentation kind of laying out the idea that this cult is telling men to seek out like this certain kind of woman. But so much of the book that I find really striking is actually about like the women who are cast as the throwaway women, and in particular Black women. You also talk about trans women in this kind of way, like any kind of woman who becomes like associated with sex work, with racial subordination. So I just wondered if you could tell a little bit more of that story to the audience to what are the processes that have created these groups of other women who are the ones who are not the one you should marry?
Yeah, and I'll begin with the question of trans women because romance depends on there being a binary. When we talk about romance, let me just give you an example of what I mean. It's like, you're a woman, you're supposed to look a particular way, you're supposed to be attractive according to our white supremacist society. I don't think I have to explain what that is. But I would just say, thin, young, white, straight, okay? Often also wealthy. The men are supposed to be, usually at least middle class, often wealthy, white, straight. So if you don't fit into this ideal, romance was never actually meant for you. And even in the early tales that were used to provide like some of the inspiration for the romantic narratives, which were known as epic poems in the medieval times, they were very clear that we are valiant and proud Christians and we're going to save our women from threats from these Saracens or Arab Muslims, right? So they're like, no, this is not about people who are not one of us. So as I was thinking about the book, and I was like, well, the way that Black women are treated, it's not as if Black women are not desirable. In fact, we were talking about top porn searches. One of the top porn searches is ebony, right? That one's evergreen. Ebony is always one of the top porn searches. So I was like, no, Black women are desired, but we're not desired as long-term partners. We're desired as flings, that might happen in a back alley that you may or may not tell your friend about. Our bodies are desired, but our humanity is left at the door. And so I describe Black women as being the commons, especially in the wake of slavery, because slavery provided the opportunity for white men and Black men, as I describe in the book, to have sex with any Black woman that they wanted without any type of commitment or even her consent. Not a lot of people realize, there have been Black feminists who have written about this, that Black male slaves could usually say to the master, I want this one. And if the master agreed, he could have her. So her consent was never an issue. So for trans women, not remotely being connected to the gender binary in the way that is specified, and for Black women whose bodies have been violable since slavery, there's the sense that they are absolutely beyond the pale when it comes to partners for straight men.
Great. Not that that's great, but that's such a wonderful explanation. It's not great at all. But I also wanted to ask a little bit about there's a lot of interesting discussion of hip hop and of Black men in the book also. And one of the things I find really interesting is the story you tell about how the role that white content creators play in making hip hop become as misogynistic as it becomes. Can you tell some of that story?
Yeah, not a lot of people realize that hip hop was actually an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. So after the civil rights movement was sort of like dwindling in the 1970s, there were a number of gangs that were forming because people were like, we still don't have the resources we need in our communities, we have to protect ourselves. So these gangs were fighting one another. There were a lot of losses of life of young men of color. But at a certain point, the gang leaders started talking to one another and saying, you know, we should work together. We all live in this space. We shouldn't fight one another. And they just decided to put their weapons down and start hosting parties instead of battles, like physical battles. They started hosting like DJ battles, right? And then within those DJ battles, ultimately there started to be MC battles, what we now call rap, which is why even in contemporary rap, there's usually some type of beef going on. Like beef is the genesis of the genre because it came from gang violence. So for so much of early hip hop, it was about like talking about where you're from, talking about the problems in your neighborhood, talking about the kinds of girls you like. You know, there were all these kinds of things that were going on. But just as is depicted in Dre Day, the video by Dr. Dre, there was a moment in which white music executives started to realize like, there's certain types of messages that we think are going to be much more lucrative. And these were the kinds of messages about, well, Black men killing one another and then Black women being bitches and hoes. And so that's why, you know, recently I had an undergraduate student ask me, but now there's more queer rap and, you know, there was a woman, or sorry, an individual who won a Grammy and their rap is not like that, you know, and I was like, well, there was Lauryn Hill when I was a kid, right? So there are these like sort of peaks, but then there's the valley because the bitches and hoes music is quite popular and it's usually the one that is carrying the genre, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think one of the powerful points that you make is that like partly because the white audience wants to see that, right? Like that like so-called gangster rap becomes popular because white people are very fascinated with seeing this particular image of Black people that's like this hypersexual, hyper-violent kind of image.
Yeah, thank you for that. Hypersexual and hyperviolent. Those are great words to use to describe this problem.
Okay, what else? I have so many things on here. Okay. I wanted to ask you to just say, well, let me put it this way. A lot of the things that you describe, I think a lot of people who are younger than us, we discovered that we're like almost exactly the same age, would maybe associate with, like people treat incels, the manosphere as like this new thing, right? Like after we saw the voting patterns of young men in this last election, I feel like there was this big outcry that's like, oh, what's happened to these young men? Like they have been listening too much they've been frequenting incel chat rooms and have been listening to too many man-centered podcasts. And I guess I just wanted to ask, like, is this actually new? Like, are incels and the manosphere, like, are they new or are they just a continuation of this thing that you're describing having its roots really in the 50s? And if they're different, like, how do you see them as different?
I think that what you're intimating there is spot on, which is that this does feel like a continuation from what we're seeing, because this backlash to feminism, I've mostly talked about it in the 1950s and forward, but Philip Wiley was talking about it happening in the 1920s, right? So that, of course, was right after the suffrage movement had concluded. So whenever women are agitating and trying to demand equal rights, there's some way in which men who are in favor of patriarchy are trying to figure out, wait, how do we orient ourselves to prevent them from getting the things that they want? And the thing with incels is like, they will often say that they do want relationships, but they want a relationship with a trad wife. And so to the extent that men want that, I think that we're seeing the incels and the tradwifery growing up at the same time, because there are a number of women, and I want to ask you about this, and in your work, there are a number of women who are talking about being soft girls. And there are a number of women who are embracing the trad wife, or talking about choice feminism. Whatever I want even if it's that I want to be a trad wife as a young woman, that's feminist. And so I wonder, like, what is your take on that view?
Yeah, I think there's like so many layers to the trad wife thing in particular. One of them I think is like another word that I love that like the young people have is the thing of being a pick-me, right? Like part of it is like once you know, like I think always, right, there are advantages to members of oppressed groups who can present themselves as like, I'm not like the other ones who are gonna challenge you in some kind of way. I'm one of the good ones. So like, yeah, there's all these other women out there who expect you to treat them like an equal, but like, I don't expect that, so you should pick me. But I also think the trad wife thing is more complicated for a lot of reasons. And I think one of the big ones is that, and this is kind of just my personal riff on it, but I think it's become popular partly also because people are reacting to girl boss feminism and like the devaluation of women's labor. So I think, you know, and I see this more and more talking about my book recently with people who are much younger than me, that like, I think I meet people in Gen Z who really, for what the face of feminism to them is just this like white woman being like, I'm gonna run a startup and I'm gonna get up at 4 a.m. to work out, like look amazing, run a startup, and then take no prisoners, and that's like what feminism is. And so I think in another way, the trad wife thing is a reaction to the fact that like we never solved the problem of women's labor. And like also I think in the pandemic, we had this moment where like, because we saw people's houses and all people with children lost childcare. Like I think there was, and people were making sourdough and whatever, that like people suddenly saw this sphere of work that women had been doing that was not acknowledged as work and had been hidden from the public eye. And so I think part of why trad wives have exploded is that there is this secret hunger that people have to have this other work acknowledged, but unfortunately the only cultural script we have to acknowledge it is to be like, I'm gonna be a housewife, I'm gonna have somebody else support me, which as your work shows, like has never been a realistic option for the majority of women. But even, I mean, as like feminists know, even for women who like happened to get chosen for that, right, like is a source of horrible and extreme vulnerability, right? Because like, you know, if you make no income and then one day that person turns on you, like it's all over. So yeah, I think your work really helps us see how like trad wife is really built into this, like this particular type of white femininity. But I think one of the reasons that we're seeing it resurge is that feminism never really solved this problem about women's labor. Or like mainstream feminism. Obviously feminists have always cared about women's labor, but like what people hear about as feminism didn't.
Yeah. You know, actually, so then I wanted to follow up with that, because one of the things that I'm calling for at the end of the book is more free love. You know, and I'm reminded of like Jose Esteban Munoz, like people like that who were like, to have an intimate connection with another gay man in a bathroom is to experience pure joy. As like, and it should be treated with reverence. But in our culture, when we talk about relationships that should be valued, we expect them to last until you die, right? And so there's not a space to revere a genuine sexual connection, even if it only lasts for an instant. And so how do we think about sexual relationships in a way that could be more creative? And how do we evolve away from the sense that a relationship is only good if it lasts forever?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a question. And then I think it's also not like, it's not just how do we revere a relationship that's only in the moment, but how do we revere long-term relationships too of care that don't fit this model, like that may be among multiple groups, you know, multiple people, right? Or like that aren't always romantic relationships, right? Like I think one of the important things that we would actually realize if we could get out of this narrative is that like people need to be cared for, but there's lots of ways we can provide care for each other that aren't centered on this, the like heterosexual relationship between one man and one woman is going to provide us with all of the goods that we need. Like one of my favorite people on this topic is the indigenous feminist Kim Tallbear, who talks about making kin. And one of the she has this nice kind of, she's known for kind of advocating polyamory, but also saying that like indigenous understandings of polyamory are like kind of different. And part of her point is that like the indigenous understanding doesn't say that like it demotes the like sexual pairing as like the only pairing that your whole life can be built around, right? Like it is a relationship. But what about all the other kinds of relationships that we can have with each other?
Yeah, that's exactly, I think, where I would love to see our society go and more feminism go. And like someone asked me recently, was I a marriage abolitionist? And I'm like, no.
I might be. And I'm married. Continue.
So it's like, which is like a bold stance, and I love it because it's like the whole idea is that people should be able to have different choices rather than expecting that they'll have, like you were just saying, one sexual partnership be the center of their lives. If people choose that, that's great, but more women, I don't know if you all have seen this, are choosing to marry their best friends, right? These best friend marriages are really becoming much more popular in the United States and also in other countries. And what I would love for like us as feminists to do is think about addressing what you talk about also in your work is sort of like this problem of how do we actually care for children if it's not going to be a nuclear family model? Because that's what we have in the West. You know, you're supposed to have one mother and one father, you know, and these are supposed to be the only individuals responsible for raising children. But many of us come from non-European cultures where a village raises a child. So how do we get back to having these chosen, more extended families where it's not just the burden of, you know, one man and one woman? And I'm sure that people love their children, but I do know that it can be a burden to be just the one couple trying to raise a kid.
No, and I mean, I think that it's almost like universally acknowledged in like the mom world now that it's like you need more people. Like I feel like that's the refrain is like two people are not going to be able to do all of the things that you need to care for a family and to make money without everybody being run into the ground. Like you need more people.
Especially now, you know, I talk to people all the time who are like have children and it's just like, it feels more unmanageable than ever because, you know, you need to have those other people in your life who can help. And the children need those other people as well, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, I think it also speaks to kind of the dark side of this, the narrative about romance and that's supposed to end in this family where you have children that like, but actually like where is the care for the children in the picture? Like where is it actually supposed to come from? Like, because also on that narrative, it's like where it says they imagine, I mean, it's also sexist because that ad imagines like, what is the wife doing? She's sitting around hanging out with her friends all day, like asking you to pay her. So, I mean, either in that story, they're transferring that labor onto a woman of color, which is quite likely, or like, you know, it just, the work just doesn't exist in the picture. Yeah. Should we open it to the audience?
I think so, yeah.
Let's just talk with you guys.
So, yeah. Any questions? Okay, yeah.
I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on like pornography, because I feel like with Hugh Hefner and like traditional magazines, you know, you're looking at something, Pornhub, it's a video. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, you know, like smut talk, for example, where like promoting like erotica. Like, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm not against pornography that features two consenting adults, each being treated with respect and each experiencing pleasure. What I'm trying to show in the work is that that's not that common. You know, there's feminist porn out there, there's queer porn out there that honors everyone in the frame. But if you were to take a look, in fact, one of the things I talk about in the book is that there's a genre called non-con. Yeah, non-con is a cute little euphemism for rape. And so to the extent that rape porn is extraordinarily popular, we can see how pornography is inducting young boys, because in my research I found that the average age at which young men start watching pornography is 10. That's the average. I mean, some of them are looking at it even younger than that, right? And it's ubiquitous on the internet. So imagine what it means to be, let's say, 9 years old, and you stumble across rape porn and you get into that. How are you supposed to form a loving partnership with another human being, right? So I'm in favor of the pornography that represents people in a passionate embrace that is respectful. But unfortunately, that's not the majority of what's out there.
Can I ask if you have found that hard to talk about? Because I wonder, I feel like there's been this upsurge in maybe the last 5 years and people kind of in our generation starting to talk about this. And I wonder, because I feel like there was a long period of time where you would get pushback for saying these things because it would seem like you were against sex in general or something. Have you faced that at all?
A small amount. I saw like a review for my book in which they were like, this is just like a 1980s porn critique. And I was like, hell yeah it is, because Andrea Dworkin was the boss, like whatever. But no, I mean, I'm not saying that porn should not exist. And if I said that, I mean, that would have no effect whatsoever because porn is going to exist. What I'm saying is that we're not noticing the content of it. As people say they're being sex positive because they're open to pornography, I'm like, well, you might then also be being sexist, and you might also be promoting sexual abuse because there are all of these like incestuous, rapey things going on in mainstream porn. Like we can't just accept everything and then say that we're being sex positive.
And one of the things that I also thought was interesting in your presentation and the story about Hugh Hefner is just that it's also just ubiquitous. Like there's like nowhere to encounter content that is not overlaid with porn in contemporary society anymore, which doesn't mean like, doesn't mean that people shouldn't consume porn, but it does seem like increasingly porn is just in everything.
Yeah. I miss the old times where that was not true, where you could choose to look at pornography or not. And one of the things that's strange to me is that we have seemingly no controls, at least in California, to prevent young people from getting access to pornography. Consider the immorality of that. We live in a culture that rightly says children should not be in porn. But we also live in a culture that says children can watch porn. Why are we doing that?
That's a good question. I'm sorry, we were going to talk to the audience, and I'm just what do other people want to ask about or say? Don't be shy.
I think I have a question that's for both of you, and it's like thinking about whether it be like the trad wife vertical or the manosphere vertical. I think it's interesting to see the rise of people of all ages, especially though people in their 20s and younger, realizing that the main hook for these like online personas is like the monetization. So like putting their extreme views out there, whether they are like deeply invested in them or not, in a direct way that's not like a lot of work. Going live is not the same as having a podcast. You are just able to get on and do these things very easily as one person and make a direct income stream. Do you think there's any like hope of like showing these people who are doing this, but that maybe like their views are impactful in a way that might be beyond like what just getting their own personal check from TikTok or anything like that?
Wait on that one.
Do you have a thought about it?
I mean, I suppose I think it's hard to convince people that they should stop making money because it's causing harm. I think that people are like, well, no, I'm not forcing anyone to look at it, right? I'm not forcing anybody, they're choosing it. So even though it would be ideal to be able to make, a claim to people and to like call them in, calling people in is hard when they're making money from doing something that they actually want to do.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a truth to that. Then I also think that, I don't know whether this will work on them, but I do wonder about the extent to which many influencers are aware of like where in the algorithms they're located and what gets linked to after them. Like, I think about Sarah Peterson's book Momfluenced, which is also a Beacon book, but where one of the things she talks about is how easily you end up in alt-right content if you start in a ballerina farm-esque thing. So you may just be going there because you genuinely like want to know how to farm, like you want to make your sourdough flour from scratch or something, and you want to see that. Or I think also, with that particular kind of content, I think sometimes people are interested in that content because they're tired and it's like, it's pretty and it's like, I could have this pretty life. And I don't think that all of those creators endorse the white supremacist content that you quickly get linked to from there. So I don't know if there's the kind of thing that could happen making people aware of like what's happening after people are exposed to your content and what's linked to it afterwards. But of course, that's also part of why they're making money. So it's, I don't know the solution. And also, it seems like maybe more than convincing people, we need better controls on the algorithm, better content moderation. But of course, like we know that the ship is sailing in the in the other direction with that. And but who knows when we can get back. I'll also just say on this point, like one of the things that I'm finding the most distressing as my daughter becomes, so my older child is 6 and she's a girl, and as she starts to become more of like a girl, like not just like a little tiny kid anymore, like is the way in which everything is telling her to become an influencer. Like, I didn't understand that was like part of the cultural pressure on Gen Alpha, I guess, but like even the good cartoons, like that are about being a teenager, they're all like, this happened at school today, now let's post it and see how many likes we can get. Like, and it was, even if it's like, someone was nice to me, so now, and like, so it's it thinks it's promoting these good values, but like the idea that getting upvotes is like the ultimate goal of everything, it seems like deeply woven into all of the content she is consuming.
Was it a Black Mirror cartoon?
If only.
Okay.
It's hard to know the difference between life and dystopia.
That's certainly true. Oh, great, yes.
So my question is, do you believe that pornography also has a connection to prostitution?
In what way? Maybe could you clarify that?
So technically, a lot of people who do volunteer to be within pornography, do you think that they're doing it because they're forced, or do you think they're doing it because they actually enjoy and want to be within that kind of platform and be within that industry? Or is it usually coming from a place of like being pushed to do it by some governing force that's pretty much taking all of their control?
Oh, thank you for that question. I feel like people enter sex work for a variety of different reasons, and some people do choose it. But the reality is that some people think that pornography is going to be an entry point to becoming a movie star. And in fact, there was an episode of SNL where Emma Stone thinks she's going to be in a film, and next thing you know, she becomes a porn star. And so that it does happen that people are sometimes simply seeking work, and they either find that sex work is the only available option, so they choose it, or they believe that this is going to lead to greater opportunities that is, of course, not going to lead to. So the answer to your question is that the reality is complex. We shouldn't suggest that people have no agency, because there are those people who do want to be in pornography. But there's the reality that what kinds of jobs can you get as a woman, especially as a woman, in this particular economy? You could have an OnlyFans page in which you could probably make a lot more than if you were bagging groceries at Whole Foods. So that alone is its own kind of pressure. And I'll just admit, I did my bachelor's degree. This was in the early aughts. And then afterward, I was like, well, what do I do next? And I was like, well, I'm kind of good at dancing. Maybe I'll be an exotic dancer. Just imagine that for so many women, it's like, I need to make money. I don't know what my options are. And then boom, well, I know that I can make money doing this.
Thank you.
I think that's
a question. Speaking of labor, I know that with Playboy, one of the concerns in the 50s, that how do I say this? that there was a lot of concern about men becoming feminized, becoming corporate men who were no longer doing manual labor, and that this feminized them in some way. You know, the gray flannel suit, the idea that corporate life was making men less masculine, less strong, because they had to play nice within the corporation, they were not doing manual labor. So I know there was a lot of concern about that, in addition to the kinds of concerns about women and women's labor. I wonder if you could say something to that, about that.
I think that that's a great addition to the conversation. And even though I'm familiar with this kind of sort of line of reasoning, and it actually goes back to the founding of America. One of the things that was sort of like a tension for the early Protestant founders of this country was like, okay, we want to have women in the home. We have only men in public institutions. Oops, we got to make sure these men don't end up gay, right? So like immediately their own idea about the best way to live life created terror, because they're like, wait, we can't control the outcome here. So even though I haven't done as much research on the sort of like idea of the gray flannel suit, but I'm going to look that up because that's really interesting. One of the things that I did find in Playboy is that it was like almost seamless that they would go from feminism to misogyny to homophobia, right? And then, you know, so they'd be like going off about these feminists and the gays. And you're like, wait, how'd the gay men get in there? In fact, if you were to take a look at the womanization series, right? The womanization of America, yeah, and then the gays, right? So there's always this way in which sexism and homophobia are tightly linked.
And I would add with this particular one, the way in which like sexism, homophobia, and racism are tightly linked. Because I think another thing we see when we see this story about the feminized man, he's a middle or upper class white man, and then who is the still like, who's the person who's left doing the masculine labor? Like, it's the man of color, and that also becomes a justification for various forms of oppression of the man of color, right? Like, he is like, he's too masculine, not in control of his desires, criminalizable, etc. And what your comment made me think of too, in terms of like how we're in a resurgence of that, was like Mark Zuckerberg saying in that speech, like, we need a more masculine influence in Facebook. Like, we seem to be really reliving a moment. Yeah, that was one of the lovely things. Well, you didn't miss mine, or you missed a lot of fodder for this book. But like, he explained his caving to the Trump administration stuff about content moderation, partly by saying we need a more masculine energy inside of my company.
Wow. And that can only come through the body of someone who wants to suppress minorities, right? Yeah. This is masculinity at its core. That's the way he's framing it.
Yeah, but also I think like to suppress and also kind of embody, but not really embody, because he's a rich white man. Like, he's wearing a chain. It's striking. He's wearing a chain in the video. Like, it's not his usual attire. Right now he's also kind of always touting the fact that what's the martial art because he does Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? What's his martial art? He trains very seriously in some martial art that I'm forgetting what it is. There was, I think, even a thing, don't quote me on this, but where like Elon Musk maybe like challenged him to a fight, but then like realized that he was actually good at fighting. But like, this is where we are with the masculinity of elite white men.
And same with Jeff Bezos, like bulking up.
Yeah. Oh, is he bulking
I'm
up?
not just good with the money and the ideas, I still have a body.
Oh, okay.
Because there's that anxiety that, to be all a tech head and a businessman, you've somehow lost your virility. Which is, it goes back to the idea, it goes back to
Right.
again and again and again.
Yeah. Yeah, we do need to get out of this loop because we keep finding ourselves here. Like, we agitate for a right and then we sometimes get it, like with suffrage or civil rights, but we're not noticing the fact that that doesn't quiet the people that we have been challenging for our rights. And we're definitely in a moment in which, like, so much of what I think people in my grandparents' generation thought was going to be over after 1970 is coming back full force. So we have to think about how to organize ourselves such that in the future, it's too difficult to put us back into the little white heteronormal box.
You know, even as you were saying this, it was just occurring to me that like the actual president's life, like very much is the life that you talked about. And, you know, like that, like when we were not really like around for this, but like he was supposed to be a playboy, right? And that was how he was, like how he rose to fame. And then since then, like stories of like being surrounded by this model like woman, but also throwing away and abusing other women have been really central to his narrative. So I hadn't thought about that until this moment, but I feel like the story could as easily be in some ways about Donald Trump as it is about Hugh Hefner.
Oh yeah, I don't know if that's disturbing more so than the way things are already going, but you know, I think that you're making a good point there.
Other things people want to ask or talk about? Can I ask one more since we ended on this like dark and sad thing? And it is still Valentine's Day. I mean, and we need to we need to save the world. So
Yeah.
Do you want to tell a little bit of the story about your own discovery of your sexual identity and like how that shifted the narrative for you?
Yeah. So actually, I came to this book. I started writing parts of this book when I was in graduate school because I had been going on so many horrendous dates, and I would use it as just conversational fodder. Like, can you believe this happened? You know? Can you believe that this man was this tragic? And you know, oftentimes people will laugh about that. I mean, we've all been on bad dates and we've told stories about it. But I was with a friend once, and I was telling her about the most recent horrible incident, and she was like, "Are you okay?" And that was what sort of got me to thinking like, oh wait, maybe this isn't just for laughs. Like maybe this is my life and my trauma that I'm passing off as a joke. And what if I were to instead start journaling about it? So I wrote a bunch of memoir pieces. I don't think any of them actually made it into the book. So there will be another book because there was just so much to say in this book. But it was the beginning of me thinking about how am I being treated as a Black woman? And one of this story is not in this book, but it will be in a future book. I had gone on a date with a man of color, and he was not Black. And at the end of the date, his car broke down, and he asked me to get out and push the car. And I was like, I will not do that. And then I was telling my friend, who's Asian American, and he was like, that only happened to you because you're Black. And like, so there were just so many examples of me not being able to be treated like an actual girlfriend should be treated because I was Black. And so I started to notice, I was like, wait, we're all supposed to be having these romances. But when you look at the TV show Friends, which is also in the book, these romances are for white women. The Asian woman that was on the show, she was on there for an instant. There was 2 Black women on the show. Neither one of them were actually girlfriends of any character. So it was like, this is never really meant for Black women in America. And so as I started like reflecting critically on my experience was at the same time in which there was this proliferation of these beautiful shows like The Politician and Pose. And I would just watch some of these shows and I would just be crying my eyes out without knowing why. And then like at a certain moment, I was just like so deep in like researching one of these characters. I was like, oh, I'm not straight. Like I was like, oh, wait. There's another sexuality that's always been there that I suppressed because I knew I wasn't gay. I was like, I'm not attracted to cisgender women, but there are so many other genders now. And when I was a kid, those genders were invisibilized. So it was like, oh no, wait, I'm more attracted to trans women, you know, than even cisgender men. And so just coming to that because of, well, these, you know, fantastic programs alongside, you know, the fact that I'd been working on this book was in itself healing, because then I forgave myself for not being married, for not wanting to be married, because I was like, no, my sexuality is more expansive than that. And it can encompass me being sapio or demi or ace or transbian or all other kinds of things, which mean that I don't have to be pinned down forever.
Better. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you both. And thanks to our online audience. Have a good night. And we do have books for sale at the register, and I'm sure our authors would be happy to sign.
Absolutely.